Thank you, Jason. After a two-day hearing and the filing of written arguments, a Washington County judge now has to decide whether to remove a Veterans Service Commissioner from office. Our Chase Campbell has the details on both sides' closing arguments.
April 28th was the deadline set by Washington County Common Pleas Court Judge John Halliday for plaintiff Larry Proctor and respondent Jared Smith, both current Veterans Service Commissioners, to submit written closing arguments in the case. Proctor's brief was filed on April 24th, and Smith filed his closing argument toward the end of the business day Tuesday. Proctor's argument asserts that Smith should be removed from the Veterans Service Commission, repeating allegations from Proctor's initial complaint. Proctor says that Smith has demonstrated a pattern of hostility toward other commissioners and Veterans Office staff, attempted to access confidential veteran records, and demanded staff prioritize service for people he had personal relationships with. These actions, Proctor says, harmed staff morale, attested to in numerous letters from Veterans Service officers and the Veterans Service Office Executive Director Darren Shearlock. Altogether, Proctor writes Smith's behaviors go beyond, quote, normal workplace friction, unquote, rising to the level of, quote, organizational harm caused by one commissioner's pattern of misconduct, unquote. Smith's argument, drafted by attorney Jonathan Robe, frames the dispute between Proctor and Smith as a disagreement that should be resolved by the Veterans Service Commission, not by the court. Smith's argument asserts that Proctor failed to produce clear and convincing evidence to support his allegations. Robe writes that Proctor's complaint against Smith and the numerous letters and other documents it included were never admitted as exhibits to the court and thus can't be considered by the court as evidence. According to Robe, this makes Proctor's closing argument, quote, fatally flawed as it relies repeatedly on assertions outside the evidentiary record, unquote. Robe goes on to say that the specific allegations Proctor makes against Smith are dependent on hearsay or unsupported by any objective data. Common Pleas Court Judge John Halliday will consider the evidence presented to the court and ultimately issue a ruling on whether Smith will be removed from the commission. In Marietta, Chase Campbell, WTAP News.